Hello, welcome to Planet America's Fireside Chat. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Licciardello.
This week, Joe Biden's unofficial transition to the presidency is well underway as Trump's efforts to prove any significant electoral fraud failed to impress the courts.
We're going to take a look at what Trump's lawyers are claiming and update you on the COVID pandemic, which is getting so much worse just as a vaccine is on the way.
And we've got two great guests for you this week. Former Obama pollster David Shaw on what went wrong with the polls this time, and former NATO Ambassador Nicholas Burns on what difference Joe Biden will make to America's foreign policy. But first, let's update you on where things stand today. A week after Joe Biden was declared president-elect by all of the major TV networks when he passed the 270 electoral college votes needed to win. Biden now has 290. President Trump has 217. The only states still to be called are North Carolina, where Trump leads by over 70,000 votes, and Georgia, where Biden is in front by 14,000 votes. And a hand recount is now underway in the state of Georgia. But assuming both states stay where they are, Biden is on track to win 306 electoral college votes to Trump's 232. And when it comes to the national popular vote, Biden's lead continues to build. There are more votes coming in from places like California, plenty of Democratic votes out there. Today, the margin stands at 5.3 million in favour of Joe Biden. But President Trump maintains the whole thing's been rigged.
The observers were not allowed into the counting rooms. I won the election. I got 71 million legal votes. Bad things happened, which our observers were not allowed to see. Never happened before. Millions of mail-in ballots were sent to people who never asked for them.
And his brand new favourite stolen election theory is this.
Quote, report Dominion deleted. 2.7 million Trump votes nationwide. Data analysis finds 221,000 Pennsylvania votes switched from President Trump to Biden. 941,000 Trump votes deleted. States using Dominion voting system switched 435,000 votes from Trump to Biden, close quote. Chanel Rion, One America News Network.
But, according to the New York Times, that is a, quote, baseless claim and a conspiracy theory, and that Dominion software simply did not affect the vote counts. Election officials in every state have confirmed there is no evidence of significant voter fraud. Now, that's not to say, Chaz, though, that there aren't some cases of voter fraud or irregularities or some glitches that have happened, but this suggestion that 500,000 Biden votes were actually Trump votes that weren't counted for Trump, it just seems like a fantasy.
Yeah, well, first of all, I should just say with the Dominion thing, I should just make clear that it wasn't even an error involving vote counting at all. It was about reporting.
Yep.
And not all the errors are involving Dominion anyway. But just to be clear to everyone there, the votes were never wrong. It was just about what was reported.
And I'm old enough to remember 2004 when, after Ohio was the decisive state that year between Bush and Kerry, and there were some inconsistencies with the then Diebold voting machines there, that there are people to this day that will argue that Ohio should have gone to John Kerry and that this thing was rigged and so on. But again, it's incredibly hard to prove, particularly when there is no evidence and no evidence of it affecting the tallies.
You're absolutely right. You are very old. But I just want to talk about some of these allegations because there's a real flood of these allegations at the moment. So rather than going through them all one by one, because it will take many shows to do that, I'm going to tell you why we should be cautious about all of them. Firstly, this is what Trump does. Whenever his side loses, he says they were cheated. When he was beaten by Ted Cruz during the Iowa primary in 2016, he tweeted, based on the fraud committed by Senator Ted Cruz during the Iowa caucus, either a new election should take place or Cruz results nullified. When Obama won in 2012, Trump tweeted, we can't let this happen. We should march on Washington and stop this travesty. Secondly, a lot of these claims are rubbish. There seems to be endless claims, for example, about dead people voting that simply do not hold up to scrutiny. CNN picked 50 names at random from a list of supposedly 14,000 dead voters in Michigan, and 37 of them were dead but did not vote. 5 of them had voted but were alive, and 8 were alive and didn't vote. So for those counting, that's 0 out of 50. Often these bogus claims are covered with great drama on Tucker Carlson or Laura Ingraham.
You saw something suspicious, we're going to get right into it tonight, happening on the side of a Biden-Harris van in the parking lot of the polling station. Now walk the audience through what happened.
I was walking and I could see these people hand over what appeared to be white envelopes, just hand over onto this table. And as I got closer, the envelopes were being torn open. There were 2 people dropping the envelopes and 2 people ripping them open and turning and facing the van and drawing on them or marking them. And as I got closer, I thought, those are ballots.
Okay, so to be clear, Deep Throat there is claiming that people pulled up to a vote counting centre, of all places, in a Biden-Harris marked van and then started filling out fake ballots right there in public. And even though they were supposedly doing it for half an hour, the only person who saw them do it was this lone woman who didn't report it to anyone at the time and didn't take a photo of it. And now she's turned up in Kayleigh McEnany's thick wad of affidavits and on Fox News. But she still hasn't actually filed an official complaint. And she refuses to give her identity to the Secretary of State so they can interview her properly about her claims. Thirdly, what people claim on TV or the internet is very different to what they say in court. Team Trump claimed in a presser last week that they had proof that 10,000 people had voted illegally in Clark County, Nevada. But by the time that claim got to court, they only presented 1 woman, Jill Stocker, who said she was denied the right to vote in person because her mail ballot had been stolen and filled out by someone else. And it turned out election officials had actually offered her the chance to cancel that ballot and vote again if she signed an affidavit saying her ballot had been stolen. But she didn't do it. So that's a little bit different too, 10,000 illegal votes. These Fox News hosts are a little bit more straightforward what they think about these claims though, when they don't know they're on the air.
Whoever is decided to be the president, remember, just because CNN says, or even Fox News says that somebody's president doesn't make them president. So I think everybody wants to know that this was done properly and legally.
What is happening? Like, Trace, we've called it.
And I think we have to look into every one of these concerns.
Fourthly, even if you added up every single specific claim currently in court and Trump won them all, it wouldn't come close to overturning the outcome. They're all things like 592 ballots having the address not clearly filled out on the inside envelope in Pennsylvania, or 180 apparent ballots in Arizona with more than 1 mark on them. The biggest examples are the 10,000 mail-in ballots that arrived in the 3 days after Election Day in Pennsylvania, but even they wouldn't change the outcome even of just Pennsylvania. I suppose there is one hopeful lawsuit out there. It's in Pennsylvania. It claims that mail-in voting itself is unconstitutional. I really don't fancy their chances of winning that case and throwing out 70 million votes. Finally, you have the absurdly obvious double standards, like the way they're pretending that the presidential election was riddled with fraud, but the Senate election and state house elections that the Republicans did well in were perfectly fine. I mean, why would the election riggers allow Democrats to lose seats in Pennsylvania? The most blatant double standard, though, as always, was expressed by Lindsey Graham.
The state of play in America in 2020 for Republicans is not good. We need to fight back. We win because of our ideas. We lose elections because they cheat us.
Come on! The problem, John, is all this shameless opportunism makes it very difficult to remain open-minded if a legitimate claim does come along. But thankfully, the authorities are still at it, plugging away, evaluating what they can. In Georgia, they're not only conducting a recount, but an audit and a recanvass at the same time. So good on them. The question some are asking, though, is why are we taking these claims seriously? Trump can come up with garbage claims forever. Well, no, he can't. Because a week from today, Georgia is going to certify their results. And Monday week, Pennsylvania and Michigan will. And at that point, Biden will officially have 270 electors. Arizona, Nevada, and Wisconsin will follow soon behind. Of course, Trump is suing to delay those certifications, but based on what I've seen, I don't fancy his chances of succeeding. What do you think?
Yeah, look, there is clearly a huge problem here with these cases not even passing the first legal sniff test. The number of judges that have basically said, this is hearsay at best. You haven't brought me anything that I can hit you, like, this is ridiculous. And the serious side, of course, is that there are 73 million or thereabouts Trump supporters who are inclined to believe that they are being robbed right now. And that's really, really dangerous. Now, there were Democrats after 2000 and 2004 who felt as though maybe they'd been robbed of the White House. But well, it didn't have a massively deleterious effect on the United States. There was national unity around issues after 9/11, and maybe 9/11, in a funny kind of way, sort of reunited the United States into common cause during that period. But we hope that it doesn't take something like that to reunite America after this. The divisions are being exploited by people who are not just seeking to make money to give to lawyers to go to court, but also, as we've discussed, retire campaign debt. A lot of this money is just going straight to the Republican Party. We have organisations, including Judicial Watch, who are offering $100,000 million incentives for anyone to come forward with accusations of voter fraud. So these kinds of people who would ordinarily just be sitting in their basement, writing on the internet, oh, this is my conspiracy theory, and yeah, I saw the Biden-Harris van, and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it's ridiculous, but it also, thank goodness that we are not seeing violence at the moment. I think that is just good luck rather than good management as to the fact that we're not seeing that go on right now, because this is such a potentially volatile situation. So reckless from President Trump to be doing what he's doing, and for people like Lindsey Graham and others who know better to not be drawing a line under this. Now, maybe we have heard in the last sort of 12 hours or so Lindsey Graham adding his voice to the likes of Senator James Langford, Republican Oklahoma, saying that the Biden transition needs to start for national security reasons, because you're really running a big risk if Trump's going to deny this all the way up to January 20. The Biden administration, there's going to be a vulnerability for the United States. Their national security will be imperiled for a period of time if there is no functioning government. And frankly, at the moment, there doesn't appear to be a functioning government anyway.
Well, like I said, he doesn't have a leg to stand on past November 23 as far as holding up the transition goes, because all this, the media doesn't call the election thing, stops on November 23. But just to back up what you were saying, I've got some polls here actually. Morning Consult poll, 70% of Republicans don't believe the 2020 election was free and fair. And YouGov poll, 86% of Trump voters say that Biden did not legitimately win the election. So that is the result of what you're talking about. But before we go on, if you're talking about the transition, we shouldn't talk about the transition, because there's actually, MSNBC have an expert, Ken Delaney, who's staying by right now, waiting to talk about the transition. So why don't we hear what he has to say?
How the Trump administration is handling the transition with the incoming Biden team, or not handling it, we should say, to a certain extent. This time, it involves our intelligence community. Ken, what have you learned, sir?
Oh, shit.
Okay. Think we lost Ken for a second. We'll try to get him back there.
I'm glad we went to Ken Delaney.
What did Ken discover down there? Was it just that Zoom had disconnected, or was there something huge that he can't tell us?
Someone in a Biden-Harris van just pulled up.
Yeah, right. So
good.
This transition process, obviously, one of the key features to all this. There's the administrative side of things. The give people the .gov email addresses for people in the incoming Biden-Harris administration. There's also the matter of the Presidential Daily Intelligence Briefing,
which is what Biden said he was worried about. He said he wasn't worried about any of the others.
Yeah, and that he is not currently receiving that. That is sometimes a courtesy which is given to, at different times, it's been given to even before the election itself. Candidates have been given that in the run-up. They've been given special briefings on the state of the economy in 2008. Both Obama and McCain were getting additional briefings, so they both understood the situation that the United States was in. And of course, as we'll discuss later in the program as well, America is spiralling into a deep, deep second wave of coronavirus at a time when President Trump has entirely taken his eye off the ball. He has appeared once in public in the last week and that was to briefly attend a Remembrance Day, or Veterans Day as they called it in the United States, November 11 event at Arlington, where he sort of stood there in the rain and wobbled for a bit and then went home again. Probably just, if it had been a sunny day, he would have played golf instead. And this guy is not doing the job of president, and he's stopping Joe Biden from doing the job of president. Meanwhile, Biden is doing what he can to say, OK, my chief of staff is going to be Ron Klain. Good choice. Most people in Washington, both sides of the aisle, say Ron Klain is just the kind of person you want as a presidential chief of staff. But he can't go too far in measuring up the drapes and announcing Secretary of State and other key cabinet positions until there's a kind of a bipartisan recognition from Republicans in Congress, at least, if not Donald Trump, that this transition is happening. Joe Biden is going to be president at midday on the 20th of January.
And we should remind people, we're going to talk about this later on, but they are right in the middle of the worst of the COVID crisis. It is worse as far as hospitalisations go than even at the beginning when things were going absolutely crazy and spread all across America. We will talk about that later on.
And this hyper-partisanship as well, it's not just about Trump being a sore loser or Republicans wanting to hang on to those 2 Senate seats in Georgia.
It's a lot about Georgia.
But it also has the unintended consequence of maintaining this tragic partisan divide in how America should respond to the COVID crisis, whether you should be wearing masks, whether you should be shutting down businesses again, all these kinds of things. So this in so many areas, what we are seeing at the moment is it's not simply just a temper tantrum from a temperamentally unfit, outgoing president who, he did better than a lot of people expected, getting 73 million votes, but he has lost by historic margin. He's going to lose by more popular votes. He's on track to lose by more popular votes than George H.W. Bush did in 1992. This is a repudiation of a first-term president. He managed to motivate his base. But the guy, he also motivated the base of the other side with Sleepy Joe Biden at the top of the ticket.
Look,
so
I agree the numbers are big, but you just need to see how depressed the Democrats are about how the election worked out to see that it didn't turn out like they hoped.
Well, of course, they wanted the Senate. And they wanted to gain in the House,
and they wanted to smash Trump,
and they wanted Ruth Bader Ginsburg not to have died, and they wanted another Liberal on the Supreme Court, and they want to get rid of the filibuster, and there's a whole bunch of things that they wanted that they're not going to get right now.
That is true. We should carry on.
All right. Now, while the vote tallies a week and a half after Election Day are showing a significant winning margin for Joe Biden nationally, getting towards the kind of national popular vote suggested by the polls in the run-up to it, there's no doubt that a lot of the polls, particularly at the state level, were badly wrong, just as they were in 2016, although it is possible they were wrong for slightly different reasons. David Shaw is a Democratic pollster who was one of the data whiz kids who helped Barack Obama win a difficult re-election in 2012. And he has an idea about what just happened with these polls, and he joins us now. David, welcome to the Fireside Chat.
Pleasure to be here.
So we have heard a lot in recent weeks about this idea of the shy Trump voter. Tell us about your theory, though, about the sort of overly enthusiastic COVID-era Biden supporter poll taker.
Looking at the actual poll results, I think almost everybody was surprised that Republicans did a lot better than everyone expected, I think, at every level of government. And, when we went back and, we tried to, understand why, or at least, I looked back at some of our data, something that really came out clear as day is that, in the United States, I think there are, frankly, fewer data privacy laws. And so you can match survey respondents to voter files and consumer files and get information about who's answering and who's not. And something that was pretty clear is that Democrats saw a spike in response rates. They started answering the phones at much higher rates starting in roughly March, and they stayed at this elevated rate for basically, the entirety of the cycle. I think people don't realize something about, phone surveys is that at this point, very few people respond. And so if 1.3% of Republicans answer and 1.6% of Democrats answer, that's actually enough to create a very substantial bias in the polls. And so, we really think that a pretty substantial fraction of the bias here can be explained just by these changing response rates and almost nothing else.
David, you say response rates are now just over 1%. Why has this become such a problem now?
Well, I think these problems are greater, in the US. We have a lot of telemarketing, we have a lot of spam calls. But I think if you look at, the grand arc of history over the last, 40 to 50 years, we see response rates used to be in the 80 to 90% range. And I think, they've declined a lot. I think even in Europe, it's something like 8 or 9%. I have no idea, what the numbers are in Australia, but it's a lot lower than it used to be. And these people, aren't answering at random. We find that people who answer phone surveys, they're much more agreeable than average. They have much higher levels of social trust. They trust institutions. They trust government, a lot more than people who don't answer phones. And this creates a lot of biases. There's other things. We notice higher church attendance, higher civic institutions. And in terms of why that is, I think there's a really interesting story you can tell. Technology is supposed to make problems easier, but this is a case where technology has made things harder. If you go back to 50 or 60 years ago, there were people just sitting around at home, and suddenly they'd get a phone ring. There's not that much else to do, and they would say, "Oh, awesome! A researcher is interested in my views in contemporary events," and they'll stop what they're doing and they'll call. And now there's a lot more demands on people's times. People are working longer hours. People, have phones. They have television, they have movies, and I think this surge in response rates that we saw in March really highlights that. And that for the first time, really in decades, where suddenly there was less to do than there was before, suddenly people started answering surveys again, and but not symmetrically across parties, and that caused problems.
And to what extent does this problem, to borrow a phrase, go away in the springtime when Trump is gone and there's a COVID vaccine? Do you expect this polling bias will still be an issue then?
It's hard to say about the future. I think that basically everyone who's worked in surveys did notice a real surge in activity after lockdown, just mechanically because people were home. I think that things will retreat, but I think that this really just highlights a real danger in polling. Now that response rates are so much lower than they used to be, and now that political engagement can be so correlated with partisanship, we're just much more susceptible to these swings. This time it was COVID. In 2016, it was social trust and trust in institutions. It could be something else next time. And, that just kind of gets at why polling is so hard. Obviously, Australia yourselves actually recently had election surprises. And, I think we're going to have to either within the industry, either make some real changes to try to get a better sense of who's answering these surveys and how to adjust them, or the public's going to have to get used to surveys being not as reliable as people thought.
So what is the difference between the kind of person who answers polls and the kind of person who doesn't?
So there are a lot of traditional patterns that have been around for a long time. Older people are a lot more likely to answer the phone than younger people. Women are more likely to answer the phone than men. They're more likely to be at home. In the United States, white people are substantially more likely to pick up the phone than, African Americans or Hispanic people. And, even these differences can be quite large. I think, we calculated out when it comes to a phone respondent, a older white woman might be over 100 times more likely to pick up the phone than a younger Hispanic male. But if it only stopped there, that is something that would be easy to adjust for. The problem, we see is that now that response rates are so low, who answers and who doesn't tells you a lot more fundamental things. Higher faith in government, higher agreeableness, which is a psychometric term for kind of how likely you are to, be nice to people. And it turns out people who answer surveys abnormally nice. Makes sense if you think about, literally what's happening. And there's other strange tidbits too, in the context of the U.S. LGBT identifying men are substantially more likely to take surveys. Jewish people, in the context of the U.S. seem to like taking political surveys. So I think researchers in our field, we spend a lot of time trying to understand all of these different ways in which survey takers can be non-representative. And probably the most important one, though, which links into some of these past polling errors, is that people who answer phone surveys seem to be much more into politics and have much higher levels of civic engagement. And not taking that into account really can give us a very inaccurate view of what the public believes.
Of course, David, not all of the state-based polls were bad. Big misses in places like Maine, but pretty close to the money in places like Minnesota. So by what you're saying, you're suggesting that people in Maine aren't very nice people.
So, it's a great question. People look at Wisconsin and Minnesota and think that they must be similar states. But Minnesota is actually, has substantially higher levels of education than Wisconsin, partially because Minneapolis has much more higher levels of education than Milwaukee. And that's relevant because, this broader pattern of social trust, of civic engagement, is highly correlated with education. And so if you look at 2016, 2018, and now 2020, polling error is highly correlated with overall education levels, and in particular, the percentage of white people without a college degree. And the reason for that is that there are very large cross-sectional differences in overall levels of social trust between highly educated people and working class people. And that's a problem for surveys, but I think it's also probably potentially a societal issue that's worth grappling with as well.
Now, you're saying that some people aren't answering polls, which is distinguished from the shy Trumper theory that they're saying some people aren't answering polls honestly. But the symptoms of those two theories could look very similar. So how do you know that the shy Trumper advocates aren't right?
Well, I think that in some ways they are similar. But what I'll say is, the shy Trumper hypothesis makes this really specific claim that people are lying in their survey responses. And I think that, that isn't really true. I think there's a lot of ways that we can know this. We re-interview people. We can compare the difference between online surveys and phone surveys. And the other thing we can do is we can match, what people say to administrative data about them, their party registration on file. I don't think they have party registration in Australia, but in the US, actually, many states make you register with one party or another, and that information is public. And so we have a lot of ways to validate this idea that people are really telling the truth in these surveys that they're taking. And I think that it really does get at in the industry, we call it survey non-response. This problem of who takes the survey and who doesn't, that's a much more fundamental problem. If we look back at all of the past polling misses, I think in the last 10 years, most of them really do come from this problem of people taking surveys not being the same as people who don't take surveys.
David Shaw, many thanks indeed for having a fireside chat.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
By the way, this is a graph illustrating what David is referring to during the interview. The proportion of respondents since the pandemic began has been decidedly tilted towards Democratic primary voters, as you can see there. It's a great pickup from David. And if you're interested in polling at all, I strongly recommend you go to our Facebook page there and watch every word of that interview, because I loved it.
You certainly did. Coming up on the Fireside Chat, I'll be talking to one of President-elect Joe Biden's top advisors about what changes we can now expect to American foreign policy in particular, and how he thinks Donald Trump has handled international relations over the last 4 years. But first, to much more immediate concerns, and Chaz, these signs looking very gloomy for a long, dark and difficult, even deadly winter in the United States. The vaccines from Pfizer are on the way, and others as well, but it won't be soon enough for tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of Americans.
Yeah, look, the COVID situation is going to some bad places, John. Over 160,000 cases just today, over 1,100 deaths today. I want to show you some graphs, though, straight from the COVID tracking project. These are daily cases and total hospitalizations. Look how rapidly those spikes at the end are rising on both graphs in the last week or two. Both measures are hitting big records. The record for hospitalizations was 60,000 until this week. Now it's 65,000 and climbing. That's bad, but worse is when the ICUs start to fill up. And this is the list of states with over 80% of their ICUs currently occupied. Obviously, some hospitals will be worse than others in each state, so this is when a state gets to the point where they have to start shipping patients around, sometimes for hours. And that's when the deaths start to add up, especially given that there's a real question about where you ship these patients to. 45 of the 50 states are currently classified as having uncontrolled spread of the virus. And by the way, it's back in nursing homes as well. Between September and late October, nursing homes saw a more than 40% increase in COVID infections, and it would undoubtedly have gotten worse since late October. This is it, John. This is the winter worst-case scenario that Fauci has been warning about for 6 months now. It's just about here. Yet, at the same time, we're seeing videos like this from Idaho lawmakers.
We recognize that all of us are by nature free and equal and have certain inalienable rights, among which are enjoying and defending life and liberty, acquiring, possessing, and protecting property, and pursuing happiness and securing safety.
The fact that a pandemic may or may not be occurring changes nothing about the meaning or intent of the state constitution in the preservation of our inalienable rights.
By this letter, we demand an end to the emergency orders issued by state and local government officials and the restoration of our constitutionally protected rights.
We further resolve that any order issued in the future will be ignored.
Unless those orders recognize, honor, and uphold, without reservation or equivocation, our God-given rights.
Now, that video was made under Trump. That's the bonfire of zealotry that Biden is walking straight into. I think it's going to get ugly.
Yeah, well, it already is.
Yeah.
And that we have elected officials saying a pandemic may or may not be occurring. I mean, that's staggering. I guess the worrying signs are not just the winter time, but also social patterns. So we've got Thanksgiving coming up in a couple of weeks. Then we've got the Christmas and holiday season, when a lot of Americans traditionally travel home, spend time with their parents and their grandparents. So that's a big concern. Also with this second wave, there's evidence that there's a certain amount of COVID fatigue and a certain willingness to, as the President said, don't let this dominate you. Carry on with your life. On the upside, we do know that the survival rates are better now, partly because more people are being tested, diagnosed and hospitalised early. So even though there are more hospital admissions happening now, people are, in a lot of cases, are being admitted earlier, given steroidal treatments and other therapies that are stopping them getting to that critically ill, intubated on a ventilator, not likely to come off the ventilator, sort of tragic phase that we saw back in March and April and May. So there are signs that suggest that, yes, we're seeing a big spike. Deaths won't necessarily spike to the same extent, but we are still talking about, we're churning through 1,000 dead Americans plus every single day. And even if the early vaccinations are going to be available to vulnerable people and frontline healthcare workers in mid-December is one of the estimates now for Pfizer, and it won't be generally available until April, May is when Fauci's talking about. 90% effective, we don't know for how long. 90% effective, that's great, because the FDA was prepared to rubber stamp anything with 50+%. So that's good news as well. But unfortunately, it's almost like it reminds me of the final tragic pushes in the last weeks of First World War, where the general said just over the top, and 100,000 people would be mowed down because everybody just wanted this thing to be over, and they got kind of reckless. It's a very troubling situation.
It is, and I'd just like to add on, when you're talking about the deaths not being as much as they used to be, and that's absolutely true in terms of the rates. Part of the reason for that is, number one, they've learned how to treat it better in hospitals, and they've got more treatments that are administered in hospitals. And so once the hospitals are full, you don't have the benefits of that anymore, which is why that hospitalisation rate is so critical. And if the hospitals become full, you might as well have been back at square one again, and the deaths will just pile up. So that's why the hospital situation is so critical at the moment.
And we're going to see as well, now that President-elect Biden has formed his coronavirus task force in waiting, they're already talking about, Biden has long supported a mask mandate to get us through the next few months. Biden has said he doesn't support one of his key advisors, Michael Osterholm, who's now talking about there being a widespread shutdown, that we just need to shut this down, as the UK is doing now. Some other countries have done a second shutdown. Osterholm saying we need to do that now. And there's about 49% approval for a second shutdown amongst Americans, highly partisan skewed, as you would imagine, to Democrats as well. Joe Biden says he's not favouring that at this stage, but there's nothing Joe Biden can do until a minute past 12 on the 20th of January.
That's true. And even then, it would have to be state by state. If they tried to do a federal shutdown and would go straight to Supreme Court, they would lose.
Yeah, so, indeed. Well, look, it was probably no surprise this week that most Republicans were still publicly backing President Trump's refusal to concede he's lost this election. While most career diplomats, though, concede that Donald Trump's unconventional approach to foreign affairs sometimes had a useful purpose, many have been fretting over strained alliances, wasted opportunities, hastily discarded treaties, and Trump's destabilising, unpredictable and erratic style in an area where steady-as-you-go predictable actions can be the key to avoiding misunderstandings and conflict. So, what can we expect from President Joe Biden in the area of foreign affairs? Nicholas Burns is a former US ambassador to NATO under President George W. Bush. He's served in senior roles for both Republican and Democratic administrations, and he's been advising Biden during this campaign. Ambassador Burns, welcome to Planet America's Fireside Chat.
Thanks so much, John. Pleasure to be with you.
So how would you sum up President Trump's contribution on foreign affairs and his impact on America's place in the world?
I think President Trump over 4 years has weakened the American position in the world in several important ways. Number one, he's diminished our alliances. We don't feel it as much in the U.S.-Australia alliance, which I think is going well, but we certainly feel it in the NATO relationship, where President Trump has become the chief critic of the alliance and has never reaffirmed Article 5. I think we certainly see it in the chaos in Trump's trade policy globally. He's given up on regional trade. The Trans-Pacific Partnership would have been a major power play to limit China's growth. And I think, John, as well, what really strikes home with many of us is that he's failed to stand up for democracy when democracy has been challenged. He hasn't said a word in support of the people of Hong Kong or the people of Belarus. He's been very, very close publicly and privately to Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un and Vladimir Putin, but has been extraordinarily and personally and offensively critical to Angela Merkel, Emmanuel Macron, and Justin Trudeau. So I think he's turned American foreign policy on its head. He's deprived us of our many strengths in the world. He's pulled out of the Paris Climate Change Agreement, the Iran nuclear deal, the International Organization of Migration, you name it. We're the country that now pulls out of organizations, the World Health Organization in a pandemic. I think he's really been a failure as president in terms of our foreign and defense policy.
And what is your expectation as president? Will Joe Biden resume a traditional American leadership posture, or is there a possibility that in those areas where the United States has retreated under President Trump that America may not be welcome back?
Well, I hope we will with a president like Joe Biden, because he's someone who deeply believes in our alliances with Australia, with Japan, with South Korea, with NATO. What he's been saying on the campaign trail over the last several months is the following, that we need to re-engage with the world. He is a determined supporter and a very open supporter of our alliances. He very much believes that the United States should return to the Paris Climate Change Agreement and that the United States needs to build a clean energy policy for the future. I think you know he's got a very expansive policy towards clean energy growth in the future. He is someone who believes that the United States ought to be front and center on the pandemic, and so he said he will return the United States to the World Health Organization. As you know, here in the United States, we're undergoing a really devastating second wave of the crisis. Nearly every state in the country is showing rapidly mounting infections and deaths from the coronavirus. The next few months may turn out to be what we experienced here in the East Coast of the United States back in April, May, and June. And so in all respects, Joe Biden is someone who spent his entire career thinking about the national security of the United States. He was chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, 8 years vice president, with a big foreign policy role for Barack Obama. He has the knowledge and experience, and he thinks that the United States is stronger with our allies. And that's the exact opposite of how Donald Trump has led the country.
Nick, Joe Biden obviously has many decades of foreign policy experience in the Senate and as vice president as well. Nobody doubts his experience, but some have questioned his judgment, including former Obama administration colleague Robert Gates, the defense secretary, who said that Joe Biden has been wrong on just about every major foreign policy issue of the last 40 years. Do you question Joe Biden's instincts at all?
I really don't. I signed up as an advisor to the Biden campaign 18 months ago at the very beginning of the campaign in February, March 2019. I respect Bob Gates. I have worked for Bob Gates. twice in my career, but I disagree with him respectfully on this. I know from personal experience, when I was a U.S. ambassador to NATO at a very tough time during the Iraq War, then Senator Joe Biden came out to visit our NATO mission, and I can tell you his instincts about what NATO should be doing, about how to repair a divided transatlantic relationship, were very helpful to me and the men and women of our mission. Similarly, closer to Australia, when I was lead negotiator on the U.S.-India Civil Nuclear Agreement, that really broke open in a positive way our relationship with India. Joe Biden was the person who put together the coalitions in the Senate at the time, Republicans and Democrats, to vote twice to take U.S. sanctions off of India and to prepare the way for that negotiated agreement. So I've seen from my personal experience about his instincts, about his level of knowledge and his judgment. So I think he's the right person, obviously, to be president at this time.
Obviously, during the Trump years, the United States has withdrawn from the 2015 Iran nuclear deal signed under President Obama. What is your hope? Should President Biden look to return to that agreement as it stands, or should there be an Iran nuclear deal of 2.0 next year?
I was the Iran nuclear negotiator in the George W. Bush administration from 2005 through to 2008. And so I think we've got to be very tough-minded here. If the Iranians think that the world will come back to them, this is my personal view, and negotiate from the basis where they've already begun to reconstitute their uranium and plutonium programs, that I think is going to be a non-starter. If they will go back to 2015 and build down those programs, dismantle those programs, and negotiate in good faith, then maybe there's a basis to negotiate. But I think we've got to be tough-minded. The other problem, John, as you know, is that in Iraq and Syria and Lebanon, in Gaza certainly, in Yemen, the Iranians are the major troublemaker in the Middle East, funders of terrorists and funders of destabilizing activities. So I think there's a consensus in the United States, really in both of our political parties, that we've got to be tough-minded. I supported the nuclear deal with President Obama and Vice President Biden. I thought it was a good deal for the United States. But the Iranians have to be willing to make the commitments that they made 5 years ago. And I don't know if that's the case.
Ambassador, you have been obviously critical of a lot of things that Donald Trump has done in the foreign policy area as president, but you're also a bipartisan guy. You work across the aisles for both sides. Are there things that Donald Trump has done that you would say should be counted as positives, as successes?
Sure. I mean, I wouldn't say that everything he's done has been a failure. I think President Trump was right to try negotiations with Kim Jong-un. I think he was correct in assessing that China had been a major violator on trade of its World Trade Organization commitments to countries like Australia and the United States. I think certainly that the fact that Israel now has full and open diplomatic relations with Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates and Sudan is positive. But these are just a couple of examples. We've had 4 years where we've lost ground to China. We have not stood up to the Russians. We've been a weak partner to our allies. We haven't even stood up for democracy. And so I think those are the issues that constitute failure here in the overall foreign policy record of the United States, of President Trump.
And Nick Burns, finally, when it comes to the US-Australia relationship and the prospect of the United States re-engaging in the Asia-Pacific region more broadly, some have suggested what's needed now is more of a formalised NATO-type treaty for this region. Would you be supporting an Asia-Pacific NATO?
You know, personally, I don't think it's necessary because we have, I would say this, the two strongest strategic relationships we have in the world, I think, are with Japan and Australia. And those are individual defense treaties that we negotiated many, many decades ago after the Second World War. We have a very important treaty with South Korea, the United States, and now we have an emerging strategic partnership. Australia does, the United States does, Japan does with India, but India is not interested in any kind of a NATO relationship. It's still, in many ways, a formally non-aligned country, but aligning itself in many ways with the other three of us. So I'm not sure an alliance, a NATO-type alliance, would work in the Indo-Pacific. We really have a series of strong relationships now. We just need a president who can drive them forward. We need to push it forward to protect both of our countries and to create the peaceful world and the peaceful region that we want.
Ambassador Nicholas Burns, always a pleasure. Thanks for being with us on the Fireside Chat.
Thanks so much, John.
And that is all the time we have for another Fireside Chat. We will see you for Planet America's season finale next Wednesday night, 9:30 p.m. on ABC TV.
And we'll be back here next Friday on ABC News, and I'll also have a new pet podcast for you as well, available right there, right now.
Bye-bye.